The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden of the South African Institute of International Affairs, normally in Johannesburg, but tonight joining us all the way in Tokyo, Japan, where he is participating, or at least observing, the TICAD7 summit. A very good evening to you, Cobus.
Good evening.
Cobus, we're going to bring this special edition of the podcast in part to kind of get some reflections from you and also from our other special guest, Judd Devermont, who's the program director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. He's the program director for Africa Studies at CSIS there, and also host of the Into Africa podcast, a must-listen-to podcast if you want to follow all things in Africa. Judd, a very good evening to you as well.
Good evening to you, Eric. Good evening, Cobus.
Okay, guys, the TICAD7 summit is in the bag almost when we're recording this. There's only a little bit time left, but by basically the meat of it's done. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe gave his speech. Let me just give our listeners a little bit of a background and a catch-up on where we are with this. This is the Tokyo International Conference on African Development in the calendar of Africa summits. It's definitely one of the big ones right behind the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation by the Chinese. This year, let's go through TICAD7, some of the things that came out of it. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he unveiled his new TICAD initiative, and it sounds like a sushi roll. It's the EEII, Entrepreneurship, Enterprise, Investment, and Innovation. And he really emphasized science and technology as the focus of the new policy. What was interesting, and this is what I want to get your guys' reaction on, was there was not a lot of discussion, number one, about huge development packages. This is typically what comes out of these summits. What's the number? So we want to find out about that. And two, on the outside looking in, we heard there was a lot about China looming over the summit, that everybody was thinking about China, even though it may not have been said. So let's kind of start with those two issues. Cobus, first to you. Before we get into the details, give us your kind of big picture takeaway from this year's TICAD.
Well, you know, it's a little difficult because I'm kind of up close to it. So it weirdly feels like there's probably some massive thing that I'm missing. But the fact that there wasn't a big number announced, I think, was one significant change. You know, the previous TICAD that was held in Nairobi in 2016, there was essentially an announcement of the number that was thrown around was $30 billion, which broke down, you know, in a certain amount of financing, a certain amount of private sector investment. They reported that number has been disbursed, but Japan Times reported that it actually took a little bit of creative accounting to really fill up the 30 billion. This time there is no big number, it seems, and that I think is an interesting change. It'll be very interesting to see whether that is echoed at FOCAC later, because you know I guessed that it's probably a reflection of both kind of uncertainty about the world economy as a whole, you know, some reflection about, you know, I guess some economic constraints within Japan, political and economic constraints within Japan, but also I think probably some, you know, there's been so much criticism about Chinese lending and about indebtedness as a whole, in African development over the last few years, that I was wondering whether this is an attempt to kind of move in a different direction, to kind of set a different kind of approach.
So two other themes that emerged in Prime Minister Abe's speech was the emphasis on the private sector. And again, he talked about that with the EEII initiative, Entrepreneurship, Enterprise, Investment, and Innovation, and also the idea of debt sustainability. And though he did not mention China by name, of course, everybody was thinking about China in that context. Judd, let's get your reactions to what you've seen over the past couple of days and just the time that you've been in Japan meeting with U.S. stakeholders, Japanese, Africans. What is the vibe that you've gotten from the week there?
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience talking to folks about what they think about Japan-African relations. This is the granddaddy of Africa regional summits starting back in 1993. And I think we've seen this evolution, right? The 1993 TICAD was about ODA, official development assistance, and multilateralism. And over all of these iterations, it has transformed. And it seems, based on what I observed and read and I've talked to folks, that this is not only much more about private sector investment, as you mentioned, Eric, but it's also a much more bilateral event. It still has all of the trappings of multilateralism. It's still sponsored by the African Union and other World Bank and other organizations. But there was a lot of focus on getting those heads of state here. They had 28 heads of state, at least according to press, and I was able to see a number of them, coming in and out of meetings. So they bested the attendance at the UN UNGA last year, but they're obviously nowhere near FOCAC. So my sense was that there's a lot of evolution in this summit, and I'm not sure they know exactly where to go with it. And that's part of what happened on the China angle. And let me take just a couple of seconds. The press is breathing heavy on the China angle, and I didn't really have an easy time seeing that or hearing that in my engagements. And I think Cobus probably had the same reaction. It's not that they aren't talking about China or talking about these buzzword concepts such as debt sustainability or quality infrastructure, but when you actually pin down a Japanese official and ask them about China, they really don't want to make this a confrontational, adversarial conversation about China, which is a distinction from at least the Bolton speech of December of 2018. It feels a lot more like what we saw at the the Corporate Council Africa event back in June in Maputo.
Yeah, it was. Sorry, just to hook onto that. It was interesting for me that the only time I've heard anyone really talking about the need to counter Chinese influence in Africa, the one person I heard discussing that was an American delegate. So that was coming from the American kind of analysis and risk analysis private sector. So that was an interesting difference for me. Like, in having spoken with Japanese diplomats, for a few years before this, I have to say that tends to be. They tend to be always they tend to downplay any kind of rivalry with China, I think, reflexively. And they tend to frequently say, we're happy with whatever China's doing. We're doing our own thing. We have slightly different approaches. We feel we can work together in certain things. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, essentially, kind of the more partners, the better. That's roughly the kind of party line that they always follow.
I guess that's a little surprising to me because in the run-up to the event for the past, say, 2 to 3 weeks, Japanese newspapers, the Mainichi Shimbun, Asahi Shimbun, Japan Times, all of them, were running this line coming out of the foreign ministry that they were going to use the summit as a way to differentiate from the Chinese engagement strategy in Africa. And then yet when you guys are on the ground, you didn't see or hear any of it. Now, I have a theory, and I'm not sure, and Judd, you and I had an exchange about this earlier in the week, but I think that this is not a high priority for Japan. And remember the time that we're in right now in Asia, where Japan is in a massive face-off with Korea right now, the changing dynamics because of the Trump politics in Asia. The South China Sea is always an issue. Kashmir is an issue. This is a region right now that is very, very volatile. I don't get the impression that Japan wants to use its political capital to go after China on this, when it has so many other issues that it needs to deal with. So picking a fight with China over Africa and really kind of rubbing them just didn't seem like it makes a lot of sense to me. But at the same time, they were kind of messaging out into the Japanese press beforehand that it was going to be a way to differentiate from China. So I guess, Judd, you never picked up on that. What did you get from the reaction from some of the American stakeholders that you met with? What was their take on this? Because in some ways, this feels closer to, as you pointed out, to what the United States wants to do, a focus on private sector, less focus on the Chinese, and really try to engage in entrepreneurship. What was the reaction you got from Americans that were there?
Well, I think the Americans here, see a sense of solidarity with what Japan is trying to do and the thematic focus that they are elevating here at TICAD7. And I think the Americans saw a lot of similarities and consistencies around the focus on private sector investment. And, one of the things you didn't mention, Eric, was they started back in June, I believe, a trade council, and they are going to offer this trade insurance. So they're actually very consonant with the Prosper Africa approaches. So I didn't get. I think over the next couple of days and weeks, we'll have a stronger sense of how this matches up with what U.S. government officials want. But for the most part, it seemed like people were on the same page. I just want to add one thing about media perceptions and what happens at events. Because when I worked in the U.S. government, we did the 2014 U.S. African Leaders Summit, which really wasn't about China. But of course, that's how the U.S. media framed that event as well. And of course, that's a different time than 2019. But, media does look for the sort of the sexiest story to frame it. So I'm not surprised that in every single media piece, it's about China. And then when you are here on the ground, it's not that China is not part of the conversation. It's certainly in the background, but it just doesn't feel as front and centered as the way the media is portraying it.
Yeah, it's a very easy narrative to pick up on, I think, that it's just a simple way to frame it. Cobus, go ahead.
I think there's also kind of there is a narrative in Japan that a lot of what China is doing, Japan did first, and that a lot of the approaches that China took is taking in Africa, Japan took in China to begin with. Including things like supporting special economic zone development, for example, or big using educational initiatives for public diplomacy, even the 54+1 kind of like Asian power plus lots of African countries summit model, was the TICAD came before FOCAC, and they kind of engineered that format, and Japanese diplomats always point that out. So I wonder if that is the the kind of Japanese approach frequently by saying things without saying them. So for example, for years the line that Japan took on that they provide quality infrastructure and they provide people-to-people exchange was always this, the implication was that Chinese infrastructure is not quality and that they don't provide no human capital transfer. So, so there is a way of shade, kind of like in the real gay sense, throwing shade, kind of like saying something without really saying it. But there's also, I think, so in this case, kind of maybe the current focus on smaller medium enterprise development, which has been a big thing that they've been focusing on during the G20 as well, and also the focus on science and technology and a renewed focus on education might be an implication that they see China as essentially being too elite, not focusing on enough layers of African economy, not building African economies from below, and then also kind of linking on to this idea that China essentially just slaps big bridges and dams everywhere, kind of without kind of follow through. But again, there's a lot of plausible deniability there. None of this is a message on the surface. It might just be implication.
I really like. I just say, Eric, I really like the way that Cobus, laid all that out. I've been philosophical the last couple of days. What is the point of summitry, right? What is FOCACs and TICADs and, the Russia-Africa summit that's going to happen in October? What's the point of all of it? And I've kind of boiled it down to, in my mind, relationship building, deal making, and agenda setting. And I think TICAD delivered on the first one here with the relationship building. They spent a lot of time making sure they had a very large and significant African participation. The foreign minister went to Luanda. They went out and made sure they got the big names. On the deal-making side, a couple of banks have signed some MOUs, but as Cobus said, you go to these small, medium enterprise engagements here, and it's packed with Japanese who are interested in learning more about Africa. And on the agenda setting, I think what Cobus is saying is really interesting. There's a continuity between the G20 and what they're saying here, and we'll see, over time whether or not they're able to interject this idea into the global narrative around Africa.
Isn't each of the points that you've made here about what the Japanese did well with TICAD should be a good lesson for our friends who are sitting in the United States government on how to do it in terms of small to medium-sized enterprise, building relationships, actually showing up? I mean, aren't there some really important takeaways for the Americans in how this was executed, Judd?
No, absolutely. In fact, one of the things I'm going to do when I get back to DC is kind of write up my thoughts, and it's going to be focused a lot on, what is the American lessons learned from TICAD. And I think all of those things are part of it. And the other one that was striking to me here is how sectorally focused the Japanese are. They don't really veer from their message. They focus on agriculture, ICT, cities, and quality infrastructure, and I'd pair them together. And then what they call human development, education. And event after event, that's where they are going. They are not trying to be everything to everyone. In my conversations with some of the Japanese officials, this is where they do make a distinction between them and the Chinese. This is what they are good at. And I think that, as I've said in other venues, that's what the U.S. government should be doing a little more, is modeling for its private sector where it thinks that there are strategic advantages.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking while I was walking around the meetings that maybe they're essentially doing what you in the past suggested in previous podcasts that the US should do, which is just stop talking about China completely, and just really focus very narrowly on what exactly Japan can provide, including things like, for example, there was whole sections on disaster mitigation, which is, I think, such a smart tack for Japan to take, because they really do have, I think, world unique levels of disaster mitigation knowledge on all kinds of crazy disasters, because Japan, is hit by typhoons, earthquakes, every single thing you can throw at Japan has suffered. But also, they realize that this is a real gap in African development, a real thing that's holding Africa back, that is not being addressed by any other, major power. Europe isn't doing it, China isn't doing it, the US isn't doing it. And so, so I think, I think they're very focused, and they tend to focus on particular sectors and then really focus on them. I think also, it might be, one of the splits we're seeing might be a split between the kind of the people in Europe, in the US, who've really focused on development issues, including programs like OPEC and, Prosper Africa, these new business development projects. A split between that kind of approach, a very business forward development approach, and the kind of older style kind of Cold War geopolitical language is being used in the executive branch or the other sections of the U.S. administration. I just came out of a long session on the way that Japan is working with the G20's Compact with Africa, which is this big German initiative that came through the G20 from 2 years ago, which is essentially first helping selected African countries to do a set of complicated reforms, economic reforms domestically, and then kind of matchmaking them with European companies to build investment. So far, that approach has actually been quite successful. Like the countries that really followed through on it is really seeing jumps in FDI. And, you're seeing echoes in the Japanese approach, this German G20 approach, Prosper Africa. There's echoes, there's similar kind of approaches popping up on, in this kind of technocratic development world. But that's not being picked up, in the language that's coming out of the White House. So, maybe there's a kind of a split there that might be interesting to explore more.
Gentlemen, I want to close our discussion today just with a final kind of thought from each of you about what your big takeaway from TICAD7 was, and what you want people to start thinking about going forward for not just Japanese African diplomacy, but Africa in general, and China, Africa in general, and where we're going. For me, what it was, and again, I was not there and I'm just observing from afar, I did get a sense of optimism. I got a sense that, Japanese companies were there because they wanted to be there. They weren't strong-armed to be there. The Japanese government seemed to be very engaged. The mood among African leaders seemed to be very upbeat. And it just felt, at least looking deeper into the coverage past the China headlines, that there was a lot of enthusiasm about this summit. And that is in contrast to summits in Europe and the United States, where Africa is still oftentimes seen in a more negative light as a place where immigrants come from, as a place where diseases are, wars and whatnot, and military things and things. So in this sense, I did pick up on that optimism. Again, I'm not sure if that's what it was on the ground. Judd, what is your one big takeaway from TICAD7 that you'd like everybody to think about?
When you read the literature about Japan-African relations, there's always this line about the psychological and physical distance between Japan and the continent. And what was really interesting about this summit is that when you make an investment in a summit, you focus the minds of your government and your private sector. Yokohama is plastered with signs about Africa, and all of the senior representatives of the Japanese government have been here. And so this has been an event that has brought the countries of Africa and Japan together. And I think there will be a lot of short-term and long-term good for that, at least until we have another TICAD in 3 years.
What struck me, or what I was thinking about while walking around there, was I wonder what the future is going to be for the kind of summitry that China has really kind of made its kind of style, or its hallmark. That the kind of super formal, very, very state apparatus in your face, kind of red carpet, massive amounts of leaders meeting Xi Jinping, all of that pageant summitry. I was wondering how much juice there's left in the optics of that kind of summit making, and whether China, whether it can start to feel old-fashioned or start to feel too hegemonic. With China being this kind of big emperor that everyone is bringing a tribute to. I was wondering if we're heading for a different kind of optics with African summitry in the future. That doesn't have this feeling of everyone gathering to meet the big central leader, and whether it's going to move in a more kind of give and take direction. It's maybe not particularly in terms of the power exchanges, but just only in the optics of the summitry.
Well, you both must be very tired from a long week with jet lag and summitry and, obviously fun parties and sushi and all the great things that go with being in Japan, in Yokohama, my old home. So I'm very, very envious of you. Cobus is going to be writing up some of his thoughts that are going to be included in our newsletter. And if you're listening to this from our newsletter, then you're already in the club. If you don't get our weekly newsletter, you are missing Cobus's insights every week. We put together this fantastic newsletter with the week in review of all the top China-Africa stories, along with, again, pearls of wisdom from Cobus at the top of every newsletter. So sign up on our website at ChinaAfricaProject.com. I also highly, highly recommend that you follow Judd on Twitter, listen to his podcast, follow his writing. He's done some excellent reports on China, Africa. In particular, I think you should check out the port reports that he did. He did this great graphic on Chinese ports in Africa, and he's following a lot of what's going on the China-Africa relationship, but through oftentimes an American prism. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. Judd, also, where can people find you on Twitter if they want to follow you?
Yeah, they can go to at J Devermont, Devermont.
Excellent. And you can sign up for his newsletter as well. So a lot to do with Judd over there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you joining us at the end of a long week and for this special edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with our regular episodes as per usual. Thanks so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.